He knocked on her door, claiming to be lost, but he was exactly who her heart needed. Hello, let's hear another incredible story. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. I love narrating stories for you, so get ready. Let's start. The autumn rain pelted against the windows of Danielle Moore's craftsman-style home in Burlington, Vermont, each drop a gentle reminder of why she loved nights like these. The kitchen, her sanctuary, filled with the aromatic blend of chamomile, tea, and the lingering scent of the experimental vegan apple crumble she'd been perfecting for her restaurant's fall menu. Outside, maple trees swayed in the wind, their leaves a tapestry of amber and crimson against the darkening sky. Danielle wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself, savoring the quiet. At 33, she had mastered the art of solitude, turning it from a defense mechanism into a carefully curated lifestyle. Her restaurant, Raíces, had become the talk of Burlington's food scene, and her small but loyal staff respected the boundaries she'd built around her personal life. These evening hours belonged to her alone, or so she thought, until 3 sharp knocks cut through the peaceful rhythm of rain. She froze, teacup halfway to her lips. The digital clock on her oven blinked 9:47 p.m., an hour when visitors were about as welcome as substituting margarine for her carefully sourced plant-based butter. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. "Coming," she called out, setting down her tea with a sigh. Through the peephole, she could make out a tall figure, thoroughly drenched and slightly hunched against the wind. Something about his posture, perhaps the way he kept checking a sodden piece of paper in his hands, spoke more of confusion than threat. When she opened the door, she found herself face to face with a man whose appearance managed to be both disheveled and somehow compelling. Water dripped from his dark hair onto a leather jacket that had clearly lost its battle with the rain, and in his hands he clutched what appeared to be a map that was rapidly disintegrating. "I'm so sorry to bother you," he began, his voice carrying an unexpected warmth. "I'm looking for Maple Grove Road, but my GPS kept insisting it was right through your property, which clearly—" He gestured vaguely at her house, a self-deprecating smile crossing his features. "I'm Miles Bennett, and I'm beginning to think technology has a vendetta against me." Danielle's first instinct was to point him toward the main road and close the door. It was what anyone sensible would do, but something in his expression, earnest yet tinged with embarrassment, made her hesitate. That, and the fact that he was shivering visibly now, his attempt to hide it only making it more obvious. "Maple Grove was redirected 5 years ago," she found herself explaining. "The GPS maps never quite caught up. You're about 3 miles off course, and in this weather—" She glanced past him at the sheets of rain, her practical nature warring with the walls she'd built so carefully. The guest cottage, used mainly for visiting chef friends, sat empty at the edge of her property. "Look," she said, surprising herself, "I have a small guest house. You can wait out the worst of the storm there." The moment the words left her mouth, she added quickly, "I'm Danielle Moore, by the way, owner of Raíces restaurant downtown. You can look me up if you want to verify I'm not an axe murderer." Miles's laugh was unexpected, rich and genuine, with a slight catch that suggested he hadn't used it much lately. "That's incredibly kind of you, but I wouldn't want to impose, though I have to admit, I've heard of Raíces. Your butternut squash. Wellington is apparently legendary even among non-vegans." Danielle felt her professional pride stir, even as she maintained her cautious distance. "You know the Wellington?" "I'm a photographer," he explained, pulling a professional camera from beneath his jacket. "I've been documenting American food culture for a travel magazine. Your restaurant comes up in conversations more often than you might think." The rain intensified, as if nature itself was weighing in on her decision. Danielle found herself studying him more carefully, the gentle lines around his eyes, the way he held himself with a kind of contained energy, and most tellingly, the open way he met her gaze. In her years of running a restaurant, she'd learned to read people, and something about Miles Bennett spoke of sincerity. "The guest house has its own entrance and keys," she said finally, "and I make a mean vegan hot chocolate if you're interested. Consider it research for your food culture documentation." The smile that spread across his face then was like sunrise, breaking through storm clouds, gradual, warm, and somehow both unexpected and inevitable. "I'd be honored to be your test subject." As Danielle led him around to the guest house, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was breaking every rule she'd set for herself over the past few years. Yet somehow, watching him try to protect his camera from the rain while simultaneously attempting to fold his deteriorating map, she found herself fighting back a smile of her own. Sometimes, she thought, the most interesting recipes came from unexpected ingredients. And sometimes, just sometimes, the best moments in life arrived like an uninvited guest on a rainy night, unplanned, unscripted, and carrying the potential to change everything. Little did she know, as she watched Miles finally give up on saving the map and stuff it into his pocket with a chuckle, that this rainy evening would become the first page of a story neither of them saw coming. A story that, like all the best recipes, would require equal parts courage, vulnerability, and just a dash of serendipity. The guest house kitchen wasn't nearly as well equipped as her main one, but Danielle found herself automatically falling into the familiar rhythm of preparation. She'd insisted on making the hot chocolate here rather than inviting Miles into her home, maintaining boundaries while extending kindness, a balance she'd perfected over the years. "The secret," she explained, stirring the thick mixture of oat milk, raw cacao, and maple syrup, "is in the temperature. Too hot, and you lose the complexity of the chocolate. Too cool, and the flavors never fully bloom." She was aware of Miles, watching her from his perch at the small breakfast bar, his camera now safely dried and resting on the counter. "You talk about food the way I talk about light," he observed, running a hand through his still damp hair. "Always chasing that perfect moment when everything aligns." Danielle glanced up from her stirring, caught off guard by the insight. "Photography and cooking aren't so different, I suppose. Both about capturing something ephemeral and making it last." Miles nodded, then reached for his ever-present notebook, jotting something down quickly. At her raised eyebrow, he smiled apologetically. "Force of habit. When you've spent years documenting stories, you learn that the smallest observations often matter most." "And what story are you documenting now?" Danielle asked, pouring the hot chocolate into 2 handmade ceramic mugs she'd discovered tucked away in the cupboard. She kept her tone light, but curiosity had begun to stir beneath her carefully maintained composure. "Would you believe me if I said I'm not entirely sure yet?" Miles accepted the mug with both hands, as if embracing its warmth. "Sometimes the best stories are the ones that find you, rather than the other way around." Something in his voice made Danielle pause as she settled onto the stool across from him. There was a weight to his words that suggested more than casual conversation. "That sounds like the kind of thing someone says when they're avoiding a direct answer," she observed, unable to keep a hint of her professional kitchen authority from creeping into her voice. Miles took a sip of his hot chocolate, and his eyes widened. "This is incredible. I've had hot chocolate all over the world, but this..." He took another sip, slower this time, as if analyzing the flavors. "There's something familiar about it, like a memory I can't quite place." Danielle felt a flutter of professional pride, quickly followed by an unexpected wave of something else. Vulnerability, perhaps. "My mother used to make it this way," she found herself saying, "with a pinch of sea salt and just a hint of cinnamon. She always said good food should taste like coming home, even if you've never been there before." "Your mother sounds wise," Miles said softly, and there was something in his expression, a flicker of recognition, quickly hidden, that made Danielle's instincts stir. She was, Danielle agreed, emphasizing the past tense. The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken questions. Outside, the rain had settled into a gentle patter, creating a cozy backdrop to their unexpected midnight meeting. The guest house, with its warm wood tones and simple furnishings, felt suddenly more intimate than Danielle had intended. She'd decorated it to be welcoming but impersonal, a space for visiting chefs and restaurant consultants, yet somehow, sitting here with Miles, it felt different, more real. "Tell me about your photography," she said, steering the conversation to safer ground. "What made you start documenting food culture?" Miles set down his mug, and his expression shifted, becoming both more animated and somehow more guarded. "I was in the military for a while," he said, his fingers absently tracing the rim of his mug. "After I got out, I needed something different. Something that created connections instead of divisions. Food has this amazing power to bring people together, to tell stories without words." "But words matter too," Danielle pointed out, thinking of her own carefully crafted menu descriptions. "They shape expectations, create context." "True," Miles agreed, reaching again for his notebook, "which is why I always write down the stories behind the dishes I photograph. Sometimes it's not just about the food, it's about the people who make it, why they make it, who they learned it from." He hesitated, then added, "Like this hot chocolate, it's not just a drink, is it? It's a connection to your mother, a piece of your history." Danielle felt her walls flutter, like curtains in a sudden breeze. This man she'd known for barely an hour was reading her as easily as one of her recipes. "You're very observant, Mr. Bennett." "Professional hazard," he replied with that warm laugh that seemed to surprise even him. "Though I have to admit, I didn't expect to find such an intriguing story when my GPS went haywire tonight." "And what story is that?" Danielle challenged, though she couldn't quite maintain her usual defensive edge. Miles met her gaze steadily. "The story of a chef who makes food that tastes like memories, runs a successful restaurant that's the talk of Vermont, yet chooses to live away from the busy streets, making vegan hot chocolate for lost photographers on rainy nights." "Maybe the photographer isn't as lost as he claims," Danielle said softly, surprising herself with her directness. Something flickered in Miles's eyes, surprise, appreciation, and perhaps a touch of guilt. "Maybe," he acknowledged, "but sometimes being a little lost is the only way to find what you're really looking for." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions and possibilities. Danielle found herself studying his face, trying to catch that fleeting sense of familiarity that kept dancing at the edges of her consciousness. There was something about him that felt both completely new and oddly known, like a forgotten recipe suddenly remembered. Finally, she stood, gathering their empty mugs. "It's late, and I have a restaurant to run tomorrow. There are extra blankets in the chest by the window, and the heating can be a bit temperamental. If you need anything—" She trailed off, realizing she was falling into her usual host routine, as if Miles were just another visiting chef. "Thank you, Danielle," he said simply, but the way he said her name made it sound like more than just gratitude for shelter and hot chocolate. As she walked back to her house through the now gentle rain, Danielle tried to make sense of the evening's events. She had invited a stranger to stay in her guest house, shared her mother's hot chocolate recipe, and found herself engaged in the kind of conversation she usually avoided at all costs. Yet somehow, none of it felt as frightening as it should have. In her kitchen, preparing for bed, she caught sight of her mother's old recipe box on the shelf. For a moment, she could have sworn she remembered something, a summer day, children's laughter, a camera flashing. But the memory slipped away, like steam from a hot cup, leaving her with nothing but questions and the lingering taste of chocolate and cinnamon on her tongue. Dawn broke over Burlington, with the kind of clarity that only follows a night of rain. Danielle stood in her kitchen, watching golden light filter through leaves, still heavy with water droplets, each one catching and scattering the morning sun. She'd been up since 5, unable to sleep, her mind replaying fragments of last night's conversation with Miles. The sound of movement from the guest house caught her attention. Through the window, she could see him stepping onto the small porch, camera in hand, seemingly captivated by the way morning light played across a herb garden. The photographer in him was clearly drawn to the scene. Rows of sage, thyme and lavender glistening with dew, morning glory vines climbing the weathered trellis, all painted in the soft hues of dawn. Before she could stop herself, Danielle found herself walking across the dew-dampened grass. "The light's best in the garden around this time," she called out, surprising herself with the initiative. "Something about the way it hits the raised beds." Miles turned, and the smile that spread across his face seemed as natural as the sunrise itself. "I was just thinking that," he said, adjusting his camera settings. "The way the light catches, the water droplets on the herbs. It's like each plant is wearing jewelry. Would you like some coffee?" The words came out before she could second-guess them. "I'm heading to the restaurant in an hour, but I always make too much in the morning." He lowered his camera, and something in his expression shifted, became more present, more focused. "I'd love some. Though I should warn you, after that hot chocolate last night, my beverage standards have significantly increased." In her kitchen, Danielle moved with practiced efficiency, aware of Miles taking in the space around him. Her kitchen was her autobiography. Copper pots hanging in precise order, well-worn cookbook spines telling the story of her culinary journey, and everywhere small touches that spoke of a life dedicated to the art of nourishing others. "Your kitchen feels like a story waiting to be told," Miles observed, accepting the mug she offered. He'd chosen to lean against the counter rather than sit, as if respecting her space while still making himself at home. "Every kitchen has its stories," Danielle replied, finding herself oddly comfortable with his presence in her personal space. "Though I'm more interested in hearing about what brings a military man-turned-photographer to Vermont in October." Miles took a slow sip of coffee, and Danielle noticed the way his fingers tightened slightly around the mug. "Would you believe me if I said I was following a trail of breadcrumbs?" At her raised eyebrow, he continued, "Or maybe more accurately, a trail of memories. My mother passed away last spring." "I'm sorry," Danielle said softly, recognizing the particular weight in his voice, the same one she carried when speaking. Of her own mother. "She left behind boxes of letters and photographs," Miles continued. "I've been going through them slowly, trying to piece together parts of her life I never knew about. She lived here in Burlington for a while back when I was very young. I barely remember it, but the letters—" He trailed off, seeming to catch himself. "Sorry, that's probably more than you wanted to know over morning coffee." But Danielle found herself drawn in, despite her usual reservations. "No, please. There's something about Vermont that draws people back. My mother used to say the mountains here hold on to memories better than any photo album." "Your mother sounds like she was quite poetic," Miles said, and there was that look again, like he was seeing something just beyond the edges of the present moment. "She was a writer," Danielle found herself sharing. "Children's books, mostly. She always said the best stories were like good recipes, simple ingredients combined in ways that create something magical." Miles set down his coffee cup with careful deliberation. "Children's books?" His voice held a note of careful neutrality that made Danielle's instincts stir. "Would I know any of them?" Before she could respond, the timer on her phone chimed, her morning alarm for heading to the restaurant. The sound seemed to break whatever spell had been weaving itself in the quiet morning kitchen. "I need to get to Raíz's," she said, gathering her chef's coat from its hook. "The breakfast prep team will be arriving soon." She hesitated, then added, "You're welcome to stay another night if you're still exploring the area." Actually, Miles said, reaching for his notebook, I was wondering if I could stop by Raiz's later. For the magazine article, of course. Your restaurant's farm-to-table philosophy would fit perfectly with the piece I'm working on. Danielle studied him for a moment. There was something he wasn't saying. She could feel it in the air between them, like the moment before a souffle. Either rises or falls. But instead of her usual wariness, she felt a strange sense of anticipation. We do a special tasting menu on Wednesday nights, she heard herself saying. Small plates, experimental dishes. It might give you some interesting material for your article. Wednesday nights, Miles repeated, making a show of checking his notebook, though Danielle suspected he'd already known this detail. That sounds perfect. As she gathered her things to leave, Danielle caught sight of their reflection. In the window, her in her chef's whites, him with his camera slung across his shoulder, both bathed in the golden morning light. For a fleeting moment, it felt like a photograph from another time, another life. The guest house key is yours until tomorrow, she said, pushing away the strange sense of déjà vu. Just don't get lost again. Miles's laugh followed her. Out the door. Getting lost led me here, he called after her. Maybe it wasn't such a bad thing. Driving to Raiz's, Danielle found her thoughts drifting between the day ahead and the peculiar series of events that had brought Miles Bennett to her door. There was something about him that felt like a missing ingredient in a recipe she didn't even know she was trying to perfect. Something both foreign and familiar, like a childhood dish remembered in dreams. In her rearview mirror, she could see him still standing on her porch, camera raised to capture the morning light. She couldn't shake the feeling that while he was photographing her garden, he was really collecting pieces of a larger story, one that, somehow, seemed to include her. The morning air still held the freshness of last night's rain, and as Danielle pulled into the restaurant parking lot, she realized she was humming, something she hadn't done since her mother used to sing while they cooked together on sunny Vermont mornings, much like this one, in a kitchen that suddenly felt less like a memory and more like a bridge to something new. Raiz's was everything Miles expected, and nothing like he'd imagined. From the outside, the restored Victorian building blended seamlessly into Burlington's historic downtown. But stepping inside felt like entering a place where past and present danced together. Exposed brick walls, hung with black and white photographs of local farmers, modern pendant lights casting warm pools of light onto reclaimed wood tables, and everywhere the intoxicating aroma of Danielle's cooking. He arrived early, camera in hand, watching the dinner service unfold like a carefully choreographed performance. Danielle moved through her kitchen with the same quiet authority she'd shown in her home, but here she was transformed, more vibrant, more alive. Her team responded to her subtle gestures and quiet commands with practiced precision. Like musicians following a conductor, they trusted completely. "The chef would like you to have this while you wait," a server said, placing a small plate before him. She calls it Morning in Vermont. The dish was a work of art, a miniature garden made of roasted root vegetables, each piece carved to resemble morning glories climbing delicate trellises of crispy herbs. At the base, a swirl of purple potato puree mimicked the morning mist he'd photographed in Danielle's garden. Miles reached for his camera, then stopped. Some moments deserved to be experienced rather than captured. He took a bite and closed his eyes, letting the flavors wash over him. There was something hauntingly familiar about the combination of herbs, something that tugged at the edges of his memory. "The herbs are from my garden," Danielle's voice came from beside him, and he opened his eyes to find her watching his reaction, intently. She'd stepped out of the kitchen during a lull, her chef's coat pristine, despite hours of cooking. "The same ones you were photographing this morning." "It's extraordinary," Miles said honestly. The way you've captured the essence of that moment, it's exactly what I try to do with photography. A slight flush colored Danielle's cheeks. I may have been inspired by watching you work this morning. The way you saw my garden, it made me look at it differently. She hesitated, then added, I have a break between courses. Would you like to see the rooftop garden? The rooftop garden was a hidden oasis above the bustling restaurant. Container plants lined the edges, their leaves, silvery in the evening light. String lights crisscrossed overhead, creating a canopy of soft illumination. The city spread out below them, Burlington's lights beginning to twinkle as dusk settled over Lake Champlain. I don't bring many people up here, Danielle admitted, leading him to a small seating area nestled between herb planters. It's my thinking space. Miles took in the careful arrangement of plants, the well-worn notebook lying open on a small table, the way everything seemed to reflect Danielle's methodical nature while hinting at a deeper creativity. Thank you for sharing it with me. She settled into one of the chairs, looking more relaxed than he'd seen her yet. So, tell me about these letters of your mother's, the ones that brought you to Vermont. Miles felt his heart skip. He'd been waiting for this opening, both craving and dreading it. They're mostly from the summer of 1995, he said carefully, watching her expression. She wrote about a house on Maple Street, a garden very much like yours, and... He paused, reaching into his jacket pocket, a little girl who used to help her tend her morning glories. Danielle's breath caught as he withdrew a faded photograph. In it, a young woman knelt in a garden very similar to the one they'd stood in that morning. Beside her, a small, dark-haired girl held a watering can almost too big for her hands, her face bright with laughter. "That's my mother," Danielle whispered, taking the photograph with trembling fingers. "And that's me. But how?" "The woman in the photo," Miles said softly, "is my mother, Claire Bennett. She rented the garden apartment in your mother's house. The summer I was away at my grandparents'. She wrote about how you and your mother helped her through one of the hardest periods of her life." Danielle stared at the photograph, her fingers tracing the edges. "I remember her," she said slowly, as if pulling the memory from a long-forgotten place. "She taught me how to plant morning glories, said they were magical because they bloomed new every day, giving everyone a fresh start." She looked up at Miles, her eyes wide with realization. "You weren't really lost last night, were you?" "The GPS really did fail," he said with a slight smile, "but I knew I was near the old house. I didn't expect to find you there. When I saw the morning glories on your trellis, the same variety my mother always grew, that's why the herbs in the hot chocolate seemed familiar to you," Danielle said. "My mother and yours used to experiment with recipes together. They were both trying to heal from loss that summer. My father had just passed away and your mother was going through a divorce," Miles finished. "My father's deployment, their separation. It was a difficult time. Her letters talk about how your mother's friendship and your innocent joy in the garden helped her find her way back to herself." A comfortable silence fell between them, filled with the gentle rustle of herbs in the evening breeze and the distant sounds of the restaurant. Below, Danielle continued to study the photograph, and Miles studied her. The way the string lights caught the silver threads in her dark hair, the subtle shifts of emotion across her face. "The morning glories in my garden," she said finally. "There, from seeds passed down from that summer. My mother saved them every year, taught me how to collect and store them. I never knew." She looked up at him, and Miles saw the walls behind her eyes coming down. "All these years I've been keeping a piece of your mother's garden alive without knowing it." Miles felt something shift in his chest, like puzzle pieces finally clicking into place. "Maybe that's why this all feels so familiar," they said, together, and then laughed, breaking the intensity of the moment. Below them, the dinner service continued, the sounds of the kitchen drifting up like a distant symphony. Danielle glanced at her watch and sighed. I should get back the next course. Of course, Miles said, standing. But before she could turn away, he added, Danielle, thank you. Not just for tonight, but for keeping those morning glories blooming all these years. She paused at the rooftop door, silhouetted against the warm light from below. Will you stay for the full tasting menu? There's something I'd like to try to recreate. A dish your mother once taught mine. I finally remember the recipe. Miles felt a smile spread across his face. I wouldn't miss it for anything. As Danielle disappeared back into her kitchen, Miles remained on the rooftop for a moment, listening to the evening sounds of Burlington. His mother's letters had led him here, seeking connections to her past. Instead, he'd found something he hadn't even known he was looking for. A garden blooming with shared memories, and a woman who carried pieces of his history in her own heart without even knowing it. He took out his notebook, turning to a fresh page. Sometimes the best stories were the ones that wrote themselves, in herbs and morning glories, in shared recipes and rediscovered photographs. And sometimes, he thought, smiling as he heard Danielle's voice drift up from the kitchen below, the most important ingredients were the ones you didn't even know you were missing. Back in her kitchen, Danielle's hands moved with practiced precision, but her mind was swimming in memories. The photograph Miles had shown her had unlocked something. Fragments of that long-ago summer floating back like leaves on a gentle stream. She remembered the smell of freshly turned earth, the sound of two women laughing in a sun-drenched kitchen, and most vividly, a recipe that had seemed magical to her childhood self. Chef? Lucy, her sous chef, touched her arm gently. Are you okay? You've been staring at those mushrooms for 5 minutes. Danielle blinked, coming back to the present. Her team was watching her with mild concern. They'd never seen their usually focused chef so distracted. I'm fine, she assured them, then made a decision. Actually, we're going to make a change to the final course. A ripple of surprise went through the kitchen. Danielle was known for her meticulous planning. Spontaneous menu changes weren't her style, but tonight felt different. Tonight she was cooking not just with ingredients, but with memories. Lucy, remember that wild mushroom technique we've been experimenting with? The one with the braised leeks? At her sous chef's nod, Danielle continued, We're going to combine it with something I haven't made in years, something my mother used to make. As she described her vision, Danielle's hands moved with increasing confidence. The dish was coming back to her in waves. Claire Bennett's secret ingredient had been fresh herbs, wrapped carefully inside each mushroom like tiny gifts waiting to be discovered. But Danielle remembered her mother adding something else, a sweet, savory element that had made the dish unforgettable. Caramelized apples, she murmured, the memory suddenly crystal clear. Diced fine and worked into the filling with thyme and sage. She could see it now, Claire showing her mother the technique, while a young Danielle watched from her perch on a kitchen stool, fascinated by the way the two women moved around each other, creating culinary magic. Through the kitchen windows, she could see Miles at his table, reviewing photos on his camera while making notes in his ever-present notebook. He looked up, as if sensing her gaze, and smiled, a warm, encouraging gesture that made her heart flutter in a way she hadn't felt in years. Chef? Lucy's voice brought her back again. The mushrooms are ready for filling. Danielle nodded, refocusing on the task at hand. This wasn't just another dish for her tasting menu. This was a bridge between past and present, a way to honor two women who had found healing in a garden and a kitchen 28 years ago. As she worked, more memories surfaced. She remembered Claire teaching her the proper way to water morning glories, not from above, little one, but at their roots so they grow strong. She remembered her mother's delight at discovering Claire's talent for photography, the way they'd collaborated on her mother's next children's book, Claire's photos bringing the garden stories to life. The kitchen moved around her in its usual, choreographed dance, but tonight everything felt heightened, more significant. Each herb she chopped carried the weight of memory. Each careful plating decision felt like writing a new page in an ongoing story. When the final dish was ready, Danielle insisted on serving it herself. She carried the plate to Miles's table, suddenly feeling as nervous as she had during her first night as head chef. "This isn't on your regular menu," Miles observed as she set the plate before him. The mushrooms nestled in their bed of braised leeks, tiny herbs peeking out like secrets waiting to be discovered. "No," Danielle said softly, taking the seat across from him. This is from that summer. Your mother used to make it with mine. I've updated it a bit, made it vegan, but the essence is the same." Miles picked up his fork, then hesitated. "Wait," he said, reaching for his camera. "This moment deserves to be remembered." After he took the photo, Danielle watched as he took his first bite. His eyes widened, then closed in appreciation. When he opened them again, they were bright, with emotion. "It's exactly how she described it in her letters," he said quietly. "She wrote about this dish specifically, how your mother had helped her adapt it from an old family recipe, how they'd spent an entire afternoon perfecting it." He took another bite, savoring it slowly. She said it was the moment she realized she could build a new life, that starting over didn't mean losing everything. Danielle felt tears threatening and blinked them back. "I remember them in the kitchen laughing even though they were both hurting. My mother hadn't cooked much since. My father died, but your mother, she helped bring the joy back into our kitchen. And now you've built your whole life around bringing that joy to others," Miles observed, gesturing to the bustling restaurant around them. The truth of his words hit her with unexpected force. Had that summer, those moments in the kitchen, with her mother and Claire, shaped her path more than she'd realized? Had she been carrying their legacy forward all these years without knowing it? "Would you like to see the letters?" Miles asked gently. "I have them back at the guest house. They tell a beautiful story, one that I think belongs to both of us." Danielle looked around her restaurant, at the warm lights, the happy diners, her dedicated team visible through the kitchen window. Everything she'd built, everything she'd become, seemed to shine differently now, illuminated by these rediscovered memories. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with how right it felt. "Yes, I would like that very much." As she stood to return to the kitchen, Miles caught her hand. The touch was light, almost hesitant, but it sent warmth spreading through her entire body. "Thank you," he said simply, "for bringing this memory back to life." Danielle squeezed his hand briefly before letting go. "Thank you for helping me remember it." Back in her kitchen, surrounded by the familiar sounds and scents of her world, Danielle felt something shift inside her. The walls she'd built so carefully weren't crumbling exactly, but perhaps they were transforming, like morning glories climbing a trellis, reaching for the light. Later that night, after the last customer had left and her team had cleaned down, the kitchen to its usual gleaming perfection, Danielle found herself taking one last look at the recipe she'd created. In her notebook, beneath the precise measurements and techniques, she wrote, "For Claire and Mom, who taught me that the most important ingredients are courage, love, and the willingness to begin again." Outside, the October night was clear and crisp, stars visible above Burlington's quiet streets. As Danielle walked to her car, she saw light still burning in the restaurant's rooftop garden. Miles was there, camera in hand, capturing the way the string lights reflected off the herb planters' copper edges. Their eyes met across the distance, and Danielle felt it again, that sense of something ending and beginning all at once, like seeds stirring in dark soil, preparing to bloom. The guest house felt different now, What had started as a temporary shelter from the rain had become something else, a space between past and present, where memories waited to be uncovered. Danielle sat cross-legged on the comfortable sofa while Miles retrieved a worn leather satchel from his room. "I've been carrying these with me for months," he said, settling beside her. "Reading them bit by bit, trying to understand who my mother was before everything." He carefully withdrew a bundle of letters, held together with a faded blue ribbon. "She kept them all this time," Danielle murmured, touching the ribbon gently. The paper had that particular fragility that comes with age and frequent handling. Corners soft from years of being turned and returned to. Miles selected one from the middle of the bundle. "This one's from July 1995, he said, his voice soft with reverence. "It's the first one where she mentions you and your mother by name." He began to read. "Dearest Anna, you wouldn't believe the peace I've found here in Burlington. The apartment may be small, but the garden makes up for everything. Elizabeth, the owner, she has this incredible way with plants, and her daughter, little Danny, follows her around like a determined shadow, solemnly informing me about each flower's personality." Danielle felt her breath catch. "I'd forgotten I used to do that." Mom encouraged it, said every plant had a story to tell if you listened carefully enough. Miles smiled, continuing to read. "Yesterday, Elizabeth taught me her secret technique for herb-stuffed mushrooms, while Danny supervised from her special kitchen stool. There's something healing about the way they've welcomed me into their daily rituals. In this kitchen, with herbs drying from the rafters and Danny's laughter filling every corner, I can almost believe in fresh starts." He paused, looking at Danielle. "You were her bright spot that summer. Both of you were." Danielle wiped away an unexpected tear. "I remember your mother's camera. She always had it with her, capturing everything, the garden, the kitchen, the way the light hit the morning glories. Mom used to say she didn't just take pictures, she captured moments of grace." Miles reached into the satchel again, this time withdrawing a small photo album. "She did," he agreed, opening it carefully. "Look at these." The photographs told the story of that summer in silent eloquence. Elizabeth and Claire in the garden, their heads bent together over a newly planted bed. Danielle's small hands carefully arranging herbs on a wooden cutting board. Morning glories climbing toward the sun, their faces turned skyward with impossible hope. "I've been trying to capture moments like these in my own work," Miles admitted, showing her a recent photo on his camera, the one he'd taken of her herb garden at dawn. The way light and shadow play together, how a simple moment can hold so much meaning. Danielle compared the photos, past and present. "You have her eye," she said softly, "the same ability to find beauty in quiet moments." They continued through the letters, each one revealing another layer of that transformative summer. Claire, writing about Elizabeth's strength in grief, about the way she'd turned her pain into nurturing, both of her garden and her daughter. Elizabeth's recipes appearing in Claire's careful handwriting, annotated with notes about Danielle's reactions to each dish. One letter in particular made them both pause. "I wish Miles could be here," Claire had written. "He would love Elizabeth's garden, and little Danny has so much energy. They would have been fast friends. But he's safer with my parents while I sort through this mess of a divorce. Still, there are moments when I see Danny concentrating on properly measuring herbs, her face so serious, and I think of my boy, how carefully he arranges his baseball cards, and I know they would understand each other." "We never did meet that summer," Miles said quietly. "I've always wondered if things would have been different," Danielle finished. She looked at him in the soft evening light, seeing echoes of the boy in Claire's letters. "Maybe we weren't supposed to meet then. Maybe some stories need time to unfold properly." Miles set down the letters, turning to face her fully. When I started reading these, I was looking for my mother, trying to understand the woman she was before life complicated everything. I never expected to find a connection, Danielle suggested when he trailed off. A shared history? More than that, he said. These letters, they're not just about the past. They're about how healing can come in unexpected ways, through gardens and kitchens, through the simple act of welcoming someone into your life. Danielle thought about the walls she'd built around her heart, how they'd seemed so necessary after her last relationship ended. Yet here she was, letting this man, this stranger who wasn't really a stranger, see parts of herself she usually kept carefully hidden. "Your mother wrote something else," Miles said, selecting another letter. "Elizabeth told me today that recipes are like love letters to the future. We put our hearts into them, our hopes, and send them forward in time, trusting they'll find the right hands to bring them to life again." "The mushroom dish," Danielle said, understanding dawning. "When I made it tonight, it was like reading a love letter from both of them. All those years of making recipes my mother taught me, I've been keeping their friendship alive without even knowing it." Miles reached out, hesitantly taking her hand. His fingers were warm against hers, the touch sending tiny sparks of awareness through her body. "Maybe that's what all this is about," he said softly. "Not just remembering the past, but understanding how it shapes us, guides us, even when we don't realize it." Through the window they could see the garden where morning glories, descendants of those Claire and Elizabeth had planted together, still climbed toward the stars. The same varieties, blooming generation after generation, carrying story and memory in their delicate petals. "Would you like to help me in the garden tomorrow?" Danielle found herself asking. "There are some new beds I've been planning to put in, and I could use a photographer's eye for composition." Miles's smile was like sunrise breaking through clouds. "I'd love that," he said, then added with a hint of playfulness, "as long as you promise to teach me the proper way to water morning glories." "At the roots," they said together, and their laughter filled the guest house, a sound that would have made Claire and Elizabeth smile with knowing satisfaction. Later, driving home under a canopy of stars, Danielle thought about recipes and love letters, about gardens and fresh starts. She thought about how sometimes the most important ingredients in life's recipe were time and trust, patience and possibility, and maybe, just maybe, the courage to let someone new into your carefully tended garden. In her rearview mirror, she could see Miles standing in the guest house doorway, the letters cradled carefully in his hands, like the precious things they were, bridges between past and present, between what was lost and what might yet be found. Morning arrived with the kind of gentle warmth that sometimes graces Vermont in early October, a gift of summer lingering in autumn's embrace. Danielle stood in her kitchen, preparing a thermos of coffee and a basket of freshly baked rosemary olive oil scones, when she heard the crunch of footsteps on the gravel path. Miles appeared at her door just as the sun cleared the eastern trees, camera already in hand. "I hope I'm not too early," he said, a slight hesitation in his voice. The light was too perfect to waste. "Perfect for gardening too," Danielle replied, surprising herself with how naturally she'd adapted to his presence. She handed him a coffee mug, their fingers brushing briefly. "I thought we could start with the new herb beds, the ones near where your mother's morning glories used to grow." They worked together with an ease that felt both surprising and inevitable. Danielle showed Miles how to prepare the soil, mixing in the rich compost she'd been nurturing all summer. His photographer's precision translated well to garden work. Each measurement exact, each row perfectly straight. "You know," Miles said, carefully transplanting a young sage plant, "there's a letter where my mother describes doing exactly this with yours. She wrote about how therapeutic it was, the simple act of putting things in the earth and believing they would grow." Danielle paused in her own planting. watching how gently he handled the delicate roots. "My mother always said gardening was an act of faith," she mused. "You have to trust that what you're doing matters, even when you can't see the results yet. Like developing photographs in a darkroom," Miles added. "You work in darkness, following steps you trust, and only later does the image emerge." He sat back on his heels, studying their progress. "Though I have to admit, I'm enjoying this digital camera age. Instant gratification." As if to demonstrate, he picked up his camera and captured Danielle as she worked. Dirt smudged on one cheek, hair escaping its practical braid, completely unself-conscious in her element. She would have normally objected to having her picture taken, but something about the way Miles approached photography made it feel like a conversation rather than an intrusion. "I found something else in the letters last night," he said, showing her the photo on his camera's display. "After you left, it was tucked into the very bottom of the bundle." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, different from the others. This one was drawn on rather than written. Danielle wiped her hands on her gardening apron and took it carefully. As she unfolded it, her breath caught. It was a child's drawing, done in bright crayon colors, a garden full of impossibly large flowers, 2 tall figures and 1 small one standing among them. "I drew this," she whispered, recognizing her childhood style. "Look, I even wrote my name at the bottom, for Miss Claire from Danny." She traced the wobbly letters with a dirt-stained finger. "I remember making this. Your mother had told me she was leaving, going to pick up her little boy and start a new life in California. I wanted her to have something to remember our garden by." Miles moved closer, looking at the drawing over her shoulder. His presence was warm and solid behind her, smelling of coffee and garden soil. "She kept it all these years," he said softly, "along with all these other pieces of that summer." Danielle turned to face him, suddenly aware of how close they were. "She kept everything except what?" "The recipe for her herb bread," Danielle said with a small laugh, trying to lighten the moment. "My mother tried to recreate it for years, but it was never quite right. Claire had some secret ingredient she wouldn't share." Miles's eyes lit up with recognition. "Orange blossom water," he said. "She used it in everything after that summer. Said it reminded her of hope." Their eyes met, and something electric passed between them, the thrill of another piece fitting into place, another connection discovered. Danielle found herself noticing details she'd been trying not to see. The way the morning light caught, the grey at his temples, how his smile started in his eyes before reaching his lips, the careful strength in his soil-stained hands. "I have some in my kitchen," she heard herself saying. "Orange blossom water. I use it in my morning glory muffins sometimes, though I never knew why I was drawn to it." "Show me?" Miles asked, and the simple request felt weighted with possibility. In her kitchen, Danielle moved with practiced efficiency, gathering ingredients while Miles captured the process with his camera. She worked from memory, letting her hands remember the motions she'd watched Claire perform so many years ago, adding the orange blossom water with newfound understanding. As the bread baked, filling the kitchen with its herbal fragrance, they sat at her counter drinking coffee and sharing more stories. Miles told her about growing up in California, about how his mother had transformed their small backyard into a garden that reminded her of Vermont. Danielle spoke about the years after that summer, how her mother had channeled her grief into writing children's books about magical gardens where lost things could be found again. "I think," Miles said thoughtfully, "that's what gardens really are, places where lost things and lost people find their way back to themselves." The timer chimed, and Danielle removed the bread from the oven. The smell was exactly as she remembered from her childhood. Herbs and orange blossom and possibility. She cut 2 slices while they were still warm, handed one to Miles. His first bite brought tears to his eyes. "This is it," he said quietly. "This is exactly how she used to make it." They shared the rest of the bread in companionable silence, letting the flavors speak of memory and connection. Through the window, they could see their morning's work in the garden, new herbs settling into their beds, morning glories reaching for the sun, everything growing together in peaceful coexistence. "I should head to the restaurant soon," Danielle said eventually, though she made no move to get up. "But maybe tomorrow we could work on the vegetable beds, if you're still interested in garden composition." Miles's smile was warm and certain. "I'd like that," he said. "I'd like that very much." As they cleaned up the kitchen together, moving around each other as if they'd done it 100 times before, Danielle thought about what her mother used to say about recipes being love letters to the future. Perhaps gardens were love letters. Two patient, growing things that carried hope and memory in every seed and root and flower. When Miles finally left for the guest house to clean up and change, Danielle stood in her doorway watching him go. The morning's work had left them both pleasantly tired, dirt-stained, and somehow more real to each other than they'd been before. In her hand, she still held the childhood drawing he'd shown her, now carefully protected in a clear sleeve. Looking at it now, she noticed something she hadn't before. In the background of her childish garden scene, there was a small figure she'd almost forgotten drawing. A little boy, just suggested in faint crayon strokes, as if she'd known even then that someone was missing from the picture. Some stories, she thought, take their time unfolding. Some gardens need seasons to reveal their full beauty. And sometimes the seeds planted in one summer take years to bloom into their truest form. The timing of the email couldn't have been worse. Danielle sat in her office at Raiz's, staring at her computer screen while the lunch service hummed. Beyond her door, the New York restaurant group she'd been in talks with wanted to move forward. They were offering to buy Raiz's and expand it into a chain, with her as executive chef overseeing multiple locations. 6 months ago, this would have been everything she wanted. Now, looking out her window at the garden where she and Miles had worked together just that morning, the thought of leaving Burlington felt like contemplating the removal of roots she hadn't realized ran so deep. Her phone buzzed with a text from Miles. "Found more photos from that summer. Some of your mother's garden drawings too. Dinner at the guest house tonight? I'll cook." The offer made her smile despite her turmoil. Over the past few days, Miles had been proving himself surprisingly capable in the kitchen, though he insisted on sticking to simple dishes. "No competing with the professional," he'd said with that warm laugh that was becoming dangerously familiar. "You sure you want to risk it?" she texted back. "I'm a tough critic." His response was immediate. "I have a secret weapon. Found my mother's recipe for ratatouille in the letters. She learned it from yours." Danielle's heart twisted. Every discovery like this made the decision before her more complicated. These weren't just memories they were unearthing. They were pieces of a legacy, one that had shaped both their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. "Count me in," she replied. 7 p.m.? The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of inventory checks and menu planning, but her mind kept drifting to the email. The restaurant group wanted an answer within the week. They were offering resources, exposure, the chance to bring her vision of sustainable, creative vegan cuisine to a wider audience. Everything she'd worked for since culinary school. So why did it feel like she was contemplating trading gold for brass? At 7, she found herself at the guest house door, a bottle of natural wine in hand. The scent of herbs and roasting vegetables greeted her along with Miles's smile, both becoming increasingly essential parts of her daily life. "Perfect timing," he said, ushering her in. "I just found something you need to see." The guest house kitchen counter had been transformed into an impromptu gallery. Photographs were laid out in careful chronological order, Claire's images telling the story of that transformative summer. But it was what lay beside them that caught Danielle's breath. her mother's garden journals, their pages filled with detailed drawings and notes. "Where did you find these?" she asked, touching one of the journals reverently. "They were with my mother's things," Miles explained, stirring something that smelled promisingly like the ratatouille she remembered from childhood. "She kept them all these years. Look at this one. It's your mother's design for the garden. We've been rebuilding, complete with notes about companion planting and bloom times." Danielle studied the careful drawings, her mother's artistic hand evident in every line. She used to say a garden should tell a story, she remembered, that every plant had its role in the larger narrative. "Like ingredients in a recipe," Miles observed, coming to stand beside her. "Speaking of which," he lifted the lid of his simmering pot, releasing a cloud of fragrant steam. The ratatouille was perfect, each vegetable maintaining its integrity while contributing to the harmonious whole. They ate at the small kitchen table, the journals and photographs spread around them like a map of shared history. "There's something I need to tell you," they both said simultaneously, then laughed at the coincidence. "You first," Danielle insisted, grateful for the momentary reprieve. Miles set down his fork, suddenly serious. "I've been offered a long-term assignment. National Geographic wants me to document traditional food preparation methods across Southeast Asia. It's the kind of opportunity I've dreamed about." The words hit Danielle like a physical force. "How long?" she managed to ask. "A year, minimum." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of inner turmoil. "They need an answer by Monday." Danielle felt hysterical laughter building in her chest. "The universe has quite a sense of timing," she said, then told him about the restaurant group's offer. Silence fell between them, heavy with implications. Through the window, they could see their garden work in the fading light. New beds taking shape. Morning. Glories closing their faces for the night. Everything so freshly planted and vulnerable. "What are you thinking?" Miles asked softly. Danielle stood, needing to move. She walked to the window, looking out at the garden that had become a symbol of so much more than just herbs and flowers. "I'm thinking about roots," she said finally. "About how they work invisibly beneath the surface, gathering strength, creating foundations. And I'm thinking about my mother and yours, how they both had to make difficult choices about staying or going." Miles joined her at the window, close enough that she could feel his warmth but not quite touching. "The letters," he said, "they're full of their decisions. Your mother choosing to stay, to rebuild her life here. My mother choosing to leave, to start fresh somewhere else. Neither choice was wrong, just different paths to healing. But they kept their connection," Danielle pointed out, "through letters and recipes and photographs, through memories they passed down to us without us even knowing." "They did," Miles agreed. He turned to face her, his expression open and vulnerable. "Danielle, But she pressed her fingers gently to his lips, needing to say something first. "When I was little, after your mother left, I used to make up stories about the little boy in California who had her camera. I imagined him taking pictures of his own garden, eating the same herb bread, looking at the same stars. It was my way of keeping the connection, I suppose." Miles caught her hand in his, pressed a kiss to her palm that sent shivers through her entire body. "I used to dream about Vermont," he admitted, "about green mountains and secret gardens. I never knew I was dreaming about your garden, about the life our mothers shared that summer." They stood there in the growing darkness, surrounded by the evidence of their intertwined histories, photographs and journals, the remains of a shared meal, the garden waiting patient and alive beyond the window. "We don't have to decide everything tonight," Miles said finally. "No," Danielle agreed, letting herself lean into him slightly. "But we do have to decide something, about roots and wings, about staying and going." She turned to face him fully. About what we're growing here, in this garden between past and present. Miles' arms came around her slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, but Danielle found herself leaning in, letting herself be held. Through the window, the first stars were appearing, the same stars their mothers had wished on that long ago summer. "Whatever we decide," Miles murmured into her hair, "we'll keep the connection. Better than they did, even, with all our modern technology." Danielle smiled against his chest, even as tears threatened. "Are you suggesting we update the lost art of letter writing with food photos and garden updates?" "Among other things," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. They held each other in the quiet kitchen, letting the weight of decisions wait just a little longer. Outside, the garden continued its patient work of growing, each plant finding its way toward light in its own time, at its own pace. Some reaching up, some reaching out, all part of the same continuing story. The rooftop garden of Raíces was quiet in the pre-dawn hours. The herbs silvered with dew and the first hint of frost. Danielle sat at her usual thinking spot, a cup of coffee warming her hands, watching the sun creep toward the horizon. She'd been here since 4 a.m. after hours of restless tossing and turning had driven her from her bed. The folder containing the restaurant group's contract lay unopened beside her. Her phone held an email draft to them, cursor blinking at the end of an unfinished sentence. Everything she'd worked for was within reach: expansion, recognition, the chance to influence sustainable cooking on a larger scale. Yet her heart felt as tangled as the morning glory vines that wound through her garden trellises. The sound of the rooftop door opening made her turn. Miles stood there, 2 paper bags in hand, his camera slung over his shoulder as always. "Lucy let me in," he explained, setting the bags down. "Said you always come up here when you're wrestling with big decisions. I brought breakfast. That bakery you mentioned was just opening. The one with the cardamom buns." "Sweet crumb," Danielle said, smiling despite herself. "They're the only other vegan bakery in Burlington I trust." She paused, taking in his presence. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," he admitted, settling beside her. "Kept thinking about something I found in one of the last letters." He pulled out a cardamom bun, still warm from the bakery's ovens, and broke it in half to share. The scent of spices rose between them, mingling with the herbs from the garden. "Your mother wrote to mine about choices," he continued, his voice soft in the dawn quiet. "About how sometimes the hardest decisions aren't between right and wrong, but between different kinds of right." Danielle took her half of the bun, letting the sweet warmth melt on her tongue. What else did she say? Miles reached into his ever-present notebook and withdrew a single page, its edges worn soft with handling. She wrote, "Elizabeth taught me something profound today. We were transplanting seedlings, and I was worried about damaging their roots. She showed me how sometimes you have to disturb the roots to allow for new growth. The key is doing it with care and purpose, making sure the plant has what it needs to thrive in its new location." The words hung in the morning air as the sun finally crested the horizon, painting Burlington's rooftops in shades of gold and rose. Below them the city was beginning to wake, but up here time felt suspended between night and day, between what was and what could be. "I've been thinking about roots too," Danielle said finally, "about my mother's choice to stay here. After my father died, how she turned her grief into growth. The garden, her books, this place." She gestured at the rooftop garden around them. "Everything I've built here grew from the roots she planted." Miles set aside the letter and took out his camera, capturing the way the morning light played across the herb beds. "You know what I've learned, documenting food cultures around the world." He showed her the photo he'd just taken. "The most innovative traditions aren't the ones that stay completely unchanged. They're the ones that find ways to grow while keeping their essential truth." Danielle studied the photo, her garden captured in the first light of day, each plant distinct yet part of a harmonious whole. "Like updating my mother's recipes," she said slowly, "keeping their heart while making them my own." "Exactly." Miles set his camera down and turned to face her fully. "Danielle, I've been thinking about the National Geographic assignment. What if, what if it didn't have to be either or?" She felt her heart skip. "What do you mean?" "The project is about documenting traditional food preparation methods, but with a focus on how they're adapting to modern challenges. Climate change, changing demographics, sustainability issues." His eyes were bright with possibility. "What if we turned it into a story about global plant-based cooking traditions? Your expertise combined with my photography." The idea caught her breath. "You mean—" "Come with me," he said simply. "Not for the whole year. You have a restaurant to run, but what if we structured it as a series of shorter trips? You could document sustainable cooking techniques, develop new recipes." He gestured at the contract folder beside her. "And what if instead of selling raíces, you used it as a home base for innovation? A place to share what you learn, to evolve traditional techniques into something new." Danielle stood, needing to move as possibilities unfurled in her mind. Her fingers brushed the herbs as she walked, rosemary for remembrance, sage for wisdom, thyme for courage. "The restaurant group wants to standardize everything," she said, thinking aloud. "Same menu, same techniques, all controlled from New York. But what if—" She turned back to Miles. "What if instead of expanding outward, we grew deeper, used what we learned to create something unique?" Miles joined her by the garden beds, close enough that she could feel his warmth in the cool morning air. "Like your mother and mine did that summer. They weren't afraid to blend traditions, to try new things. Every recipe they created together was an experiment in possibility." Danielle found herself leaning into him, and his arms came around her naturally, as if they'd been doing this forever. Above them, the sky was shifting from gold to clear October blue. Below, she could hear her kitchen team arriving, the familiar sounds of raíces coming to life for another day. "We'd have to plan carefully," she said, her practical nature asserting itself even as her heart raced with excitement. "I'd need to train my team to handle longer absences, set up systems." "We have time," Miles assured her. "The project doesn't start until spring, and—" He hesitated, then continued softly. "I thought maybe we could use these months to see what else might grow between us. No pressure, no expectations, just possibility." Danielle turned in his arms to face him. The morning light caught the silver in his hair, the warmth in his eyes, and suddenly all her careful walls seemed unnecessary. Here was someone who understood the language of gardens and growth, of roots and reaching higher. "Possibility," she repeated, raising one hand to trace the line of his jaw. "I like that word." His smile was radiant as he leaned down to meet her, and when their lips finally met, it felt like the most natural growth of all, as inevitable as morning glories. Turning toward the sun, as surprising as seeds sprouting after winter's long sleep. When they finally parted, the sun was fully up, and somewhere below, Lucy was calling Danielle's name, the morning's work waiting to begin. "I should go," she said reluctantly. "But tonight, come to dinner at my house? I want to try something. With those recipes we found, a fusion of your mother's ratatouille and my new techniques. Something that honors the past while growing toward the future. I'll bring my camera," Miles promised, "and maybe we can look at maps after dinner, start dreaming up some possible routes." "Roots with roots," Danielle said, smiling at the wordplay. "I like that." As she headed down to her kitchen, Danielle felt lighter than she had in days. Through the rooftop garden's glass doors, she could see Miles still standing among the herbs, his camera raised to capture the morning light. He looked completely at home there, as if he'd always been meant to be part of this garden's story. Perhaps, she thought, that was the real lesson their mothers had left them, that love, like gardens, needed both roots and room to grow. That sometimes the bravest choice wasn't between staying or going, but finding a way to do both, carrying your roots with you while reaching for new light. 1 year later, the October evening was unseasonably warm, the kind of gentle weather that felt like a gift from summer to autumn. Danielle stood in her garden, now lusher and more vibrant than ever, carefully picking herbs for tonight's special dinner. The morning glories were closing their faces for the day, their deep blue petals folding like origami in the fading light. Inside the house, she could hear Miles moving around the kitchen, probably setting up one of his signature photography angles. He'd recently won an award for his Global Gardens series, intimate portraits of sustainable food traditions that had taken them from rooftop gardens in Singapore to ancient terraces in Peru. But it was their own garden that remained his favorite subject, especially in this golden hour light. "The table's set," he called from the doorway. "Lucy and Robert should be here soon. Are you sure you don't want help with the harvesting?" Danielle smiled, remembering his first awkward attempts at herb gathering. He'd improved considerably over the past year, but some tasks she still preferred to do herself. Almost done. Just getting the last of the sage. The herbs would feature in tonight's dinner, a celebration of Raiz's successful transformation. What had started as an idea on the rooftop garden that dawn morning had blossomed into something neither of them had quite expected. The restaurant had become a hub for sustainable cooking innovation, each of their research trips inspiring new dishes that honored traditional techniques while embracing modern consciousness. The sound of car doors closing announced their guest's arrival. Lucy, now effectively running Raiz's day-to-day operations, had been instrumental in making their travel schedule possible. And Robert, the quiet farmer who supplied their produce, had proven to have an unexpected talent for fusion cuisine that made him an invaluable part of their recipe development team. "Something smells amazing," Lucy called out as she rounded the corner into the garden. She was carrying a bottle of natural wine and what looked like one of her famous sourdough loaves. "Claire's ratatouille," Danielle explained, gathering her herb basket, "but with a twist we learned in Thailand. And wait until you see what Miles did with the presentation." Inside, the kitchen glowed with warm light. The long farmhouse table was set with the mismatched plates Danielle and Miles had collected on their travels, each one carrying a story, a memory of markets explored and meals shared. Photos from their trips lined the walls, interspersed with framed pages from Claire and Elizabeth's letters. Miles was putting the finishing touches on the appetizers, delicate rice paper rolls filled with herbs from their garden and vegetables from Robert's farm, a technique they'd learned in Vietnam but adapted to Vermont's seasonal produce. "Before we sit down," he said, reaching for a familiar leather satchel, "I found one more letter. It was tucked into my mother's old camera case. I think she meant for us to find it now." They gathered around the table as Miles carefully unfolded the paper. The handwriting was Claire's, but the date was much later than the others, just months before she passed away. "My dearest Miles," he read, his voice soft with emotion. "If you're reading this, then you've found your way back to Vermont, back to the garden where so much began. I've carried that summer with me all these years, the peace I found there, the friendship that helped me believe in new beginnings. Elizabeth used to say that gardens are really stories we tell with growing things. Your father and I found our way back to each other eventually, but it was the lessons I learned in that Vermont garden that gave me the courage to try again, to believe that sometimes love needs time and distance to find its truest form." Danielle reached for Miles's hand as he continued reading. "I've watched you grow into a man who sees beauty in quiet moments, who understands that the most important stories often go untold. I hope you've found your way to Elizabeth's daughter, the little girl who taught me that joy can grow in the most unexpected places. And I hope you've discovered what I learned that summer, that love, like a garden, thrives best when we give it both roots and wings. Silence fell as Miles carefully folded the letter. Outside, the last light of day painted the garden in shades of gold and purple, and through the kitchen window they could see the first stars appearing. To Claire and Elizabeth, Lucy said, raising her wine glass, and to the garden that keeps giving. They clinked glasses, and Danielle felt Miles's arm slip around her waist, pulling her close. The past year had been a journey neither of them had expected, full of challenges and discoveries, moments of doubt balanced by profound joy. They'd learned to blend their lives like ingredients in a well-loved recipe, each bringing their own flavors to create something new. "I have news," Danielle said once they were settled around the table, the ratatouille steaming fragrant and inviting before them. "The publisher loved the cookbook idea. They want us to expand it into a series, sustainable traditions from around the world, adapted for home gardens and kitchens." "With your recipes and Miles's photos?" Lucy asked, serving herself a generous portion. "That's perfect." "And something else," Miles added, that familiar warm smile spreading across his face. "Show them." Danielle withdrew a worn notebook from her apron pocket, her mother's last garden journal, discovered just yesterday in a box of old books. "Look at the last entry," she said, opening to a page marked with a pressed morning glory bloom. The entry was dated just weeks before Elizabeth's passing. Gardens, like love stories, don't really end. They just keep growing in new ways, finding new soil, new seasons. Claire's morning glories still bloom in my daughter's garden, and somewhere in California, a young man takes pictures that capture moments of grace. Someday, perhaps, these separate gardens will grow together again. Seeds, after all, know their own time for blooming. "She knew," Miles said softly. "Somehow, she knew we'd find our way here." Later that night, after Lucy and Robert had gone, home laden with leftovers and plans for next week's menu, Danielle and Miles stood in their garden. The motion sensor lights cast soft illumination over the beds they'd tended together, the herbs they'd gathered, the morning glories sleeping. "Until dawn, I've been thinking," Miles said, pulling her close, "about what's next, about roots and wings." "And what have you decided?" Danielle asked, though she could guess from the look in his eyes. "That sometimes the greatest adventures happen right here." He gestured to the garden, to the home they'd made together, "that maybe it's time to plant some new seeds." Danielle turned in his arms, understanding his meaning. "Are you sure? With all our traveling?" "Lucy runs the restaurant beautifully when we're gone. Our garden thrives, and children, like morning glories, can bloom anywhere." He touched her cheek gently. "What do you think?" Instead of answering immediately, Danielle led him to the trellis where Claire's morning glories, now their morning glories, climbed toward the stars. In the soft light, she could almost see the shadows of that long-ago summer. Two women finding healing in a garden. A little girl learning to plant seeds. A boy across the country taking his first photographs. "I think," she said finally, "that love stories, like gardens, know their own time for growing." Miles's kiss tasted of herbs and possibility, of adventures completed and adventures yet to begin. Above them, the Vermont stars shone clear and bright, the same stars that had witnessed so many beginnings in this garden. And somewhere, Danielle thought, two women were smiling, watching love bloom again in the garden where they had planted its first seeds so many seasons ago. The end. Thanks for watching to the end. Did you like the story? Tell us what you thought in the comments below. We want to know what you think. Don't forget to leave your like and subscribe now for more exciting stories you won't want to miss. Activate the bell to be notified whenever a new video comes out. See you in the next story. See you there.